2 hours before the fire, Johnny Carson sat alone in his dressing room, staring at a photograph he kept face down in his desk drawer. He did this sometimes, on nights when the weight felt heavier than usual. The photograph was old, black and white, creased at the corners. A younger version of himself, smiling in a way he no longer recognized. He put it back without looking at it for long. The Tonight Show was about to begin its 11th year. Outside his door, the machinery of late-night television hummed with practiced efficiency. Writers shuffled cue cards. Stage managers counted down minutes. The band tuned instruments that had been tuned an hour before. Everything moved like clockwork, and Johnny Carson was the center of that clock. But something felt different tonight. He couldn't name it. A thickness in the air, perhaps, or the way the hallway lights seemed dimmer than usual. His assistant had called in sick. The backup host, the one they kept on standby in case Carson ever faltered, was out of town. Small things, meaningless things, yet they accumulated in the back of his mind like coins in a jar. Burt Reynolds was the guest. Reynolds was easy, charming, quick, good for ratings. They'd done this dance before. Carson knew which questions would land, which stories Reynolds would tell. There was comfort in that predictability. In a world that felt increasingly uncontrollable, The Tonight Show was the one place where Johnny Carson still held all the cards. Or so he thought. At 5:47 p.m., a stagehand named Michael Torres smelled something burning. He was checking the lighting rig above stage 1, 20 feet up on a catwalk, when the scent hit him. Electrical. Sharp. The kind of smell that makes your stomach drop before your brain catches up. He followed it to Junction Box C, a metal housing tucked behind the main spotlight array. When he opened it, he saw the problem immediately. Exposed wiring. Sparking, and beneath it, a small pile of wadded paper someone had shoved there months ago, smoldering. Michael did what he'd been trained to do. He radioed down to the technical supervisor. He grabbed the fire extinguisher mounted to the catwalk railing, and he put out the fire. Almost. What Michael didn't see, what he couldn't see, because it was hidden behind the junction box itself, was that the fire had already spread into the wall cavity. It was crawling through decades-old insulation, moving slowly, patiently, toward the main stage. By the time The Tonight Show went live at 5:30 p.m. Pacific Time, the fire had been burning inside the walls for 11 minutes. Johnny Carson walked onto the stage to the sound of Doc Severinsen's trumpet and 400 people applauding in unison. He smiled. He waved. He told his monologue jokes with the timing of a man who had told 30,000 jokes before these. The audience laughed in all the right places. Backstage, in the control booth, director Bobby Quinn saw the first sign of trouble at 5:38 p.m. Smoke. Not much, just a thin gray thread curling from an air vent near camera 2. He blinked. Still there. He keyed his headset. Stage right. Are we seeing smoke near camera 2? The camera operator glanced up. Yeah, I see it. Probably dust burning off a light. Bobby nodded. That happens sometimes. Hot lights, old equipment. Nothing to panic about. But the smoke didn't stop. By 5:41 p.m., it was visible to the audience. A haze forming along the back wall, creeping forward like morning fog. People in the front rows started to notice. A woman coughed. A man leaned over to his wife and whispered something. On stage, Johnny Carson saw it too. He was mid-sentence, setting up a joke about gasoline prices, when he noticed the change in the room. The audience's attention had split. Half of them were still watching him. The other half were looking past him toward the back of the set. He didn't turn around. Not yet. That was the first rule. Never break the illusion unless you absolutely have to. Instead, he finished the joke, got the laugh, and then, during the applause, he let his eyes flick toward Bobby in the control booth. Bobby was on his feet, headset pressed to his ear, talking fast. Carson's smile never wavered, but his hand, resting on the desk, curled into a fist. At 5:43 p.m., the fire alarm should have gone off. It didn't. Later, investigators would discover that the alarm system in Studio 1 had been disabled 3 weeks earlier during a renovation. Someone had forgotten to reconnect it. In the chaos of daily production, no one had noticed. So when the fire breached the wall and entered the backstage area, there was no warning, no sirens, no flashing lights, just smoke, thickening by the second. Bobby Quinn made the decision at 5:44 p.m. He spoke directly into Carson's earpiece, his voice tight but controlled. "Johnny, we have a situation. There's smoke backstage. Could be a fire. We need to evacuate." Carson's face didn't change. He was laughing at something Ed McMahon had just said, leaning back in his chair like he had all the time in the world. But his voice, when he responded, was ice. "How bad?" "Unknown, but it's spreading." "Are we live?" "Yes." Carson's mind moved fast. 40 million people were watching. If he announced a fire, there would be panic. 400 people in the audience, all trying to reach the same exits at once. People would be trampled, hurt, maybe killed. And if he didn't announce it and the fire spread faster than expected, he had maybe 3 seconds to decide. "Keep the cameras on me," Carson said quietly. "I'm not stopping the show." Bobby's voice crackled back, disbelief threading through the static. "Johnny, this isn't—" "I said keep the cameras on me." Burt Reynolds was waiting in the wings. He'd been scheduled to come out after the next commercial break. But when the stage manager told him about the smoke, Reynolds did something unexpected. He walked on stage early. No music, no introduction. He just strode out, sat down in the guest chair, and looked at Carson. "Hey, John," Reynolds said, his voice easy, relaxed. "Thought I'd come out and chat a little early. Hope that's okay." The audience laughed, confused but delighted. Burt Reynolds' breaking protocol was exactly the kind of spontaneous moment they'd come to see. Carson understood immediately. Reynolds had seen the smoke, and instead of evacuating, he'd walked toward it. "Burt," Carson said, "you're early." "Yeah, well." Reynolds leaned back, crossed his legs. "I heard you were going to talk about me behind my back, so I figured I'd better get out here." Another laugh, bigger this time. Behind them, the smoke was now clearly visible on camera. Dark gray tendrils curling across the back wall, lit by stage lights that made them look almost theatrical. At 5:46 p.m., one of the cameras caught it, a small lick of flame, visible through a crack in the back paneling. The director in the booth swore. "Cut to camera 1. Tight on Johnny. Don't show the back wall." The image on millions of television screens across America shifted. Now it was just Carson and Reynolds, 2 men talking, smiling, utterly calm. What the cameras didn't show was the chaos unfolding 10 feet behind them. Stage crew were running now, fire extinguishers in hand, moving toward the source of the smoke. The audience had started to murmur, a low, anxious sound like distant thunder. Carson could feel it, the room shifting from curiosity to fear. He did the only thing he knew how to do. He started talking. "Burt, I heard a story about you," Carson said, his voice smooth, conversational. "Something about a car chase in Georgia." Reynolds picked up the thread without hesitation. "Oh, that. Yeah, that was a hell of a day." And he launched into a story. Something about a movie set, a broken-down Pontiac, a highway patrolman with a sense of humor. It wasn't a great story. It didn't matter. What mattered was that Reynolds was talking and people were listening. Carson watched the audience, saw them lean in, saw the fear in their eyes start to dim, replaced by something else. Focus. Attention. He glanced at Bobby in the booth. Bobby held up 7 fingers. 7 minutes until the scheduled commercial break. 7 minutes. Behind the back wall, the fire had found something new to consume. Old paint. Dry wood. Foam padding from an ancient set piece. The flames grew. At 5:48 p.m., a piece of burning insulation fell from the ceiling and landed on the stage floor, 6 feet behind Carson's desk. The audience gasped. Carson turned, looked at it, and then looked back at Reynolds. "You know," he said calmly, "I think we're having some technical difficulties tonight." The audience laughed, not because it was funny, but because Johnny Carson had said it, and Johnny Carson saying something made it safe. Reynolds never broke character. "You want me to put that out, or—" "Nah, let it burn, adds atmosphere." Bigger laugh, the kind that comes from relief as much as humor. Ed McMahon appeared from stage left, fire extinguisher in hand. He walked over to the burning insulation, sprayed it down, and then sat back down at his desk without saying a word. The audience roared. On television screens across America, it looked like a bit, a planned moment of chaos. The kind of thing The Tonight Show did sometimes, just to keep things interesting. No one watching at home knew that Ed's hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the extinguisher. At 5:50 p.m., Bobby Quinn made a second decision. He spoke to the stage managers through their headsets, his voice steady despite everything. Start evacuating the audience. Quietly. No announcements. Just start moving people toward the exits. Stage managers nodded. They began moving through the rows, leaning down, whispering to people. We need to step outside for just a moment. Nothing to worry about. Just a precaution. Some people resisted. They'd waited months for these tickets. They weren't going to miss seeing Johnny Carson live. But the stage managers were persistent, and the smoke was getting harder to ignore. One by one, rows emptied. People filed out through the side exits, craning their necks to keep watching the stage as long as possible. Carson saw it happening, watched his audience dissolve in real time. He kept talking, Reynolds kept talking, and the fire kept burning. At 5:52 p.m., the flames breached the back wall entirely. A section of paneling collapsed, revealing the inferno behind it. Orange light flooded the stage, bright enough to cast new shadows. The last few audience members who'd been resisting evacuation finally stood and hurried toward the exits. Carson and Reynolds were alone now. Just them, the cameras, and 40 million people watching from home. "Burt," Carson said, his voice finally showing the first crack, "I think we should probably wrap this up." Reynolds looked at the fire, looked back at Carson. "Yeah, probably." But neither of them moved. Bobby's voice came through Carson's earpiece, urgent now. "Johnny, you need to go. Now." "How much time until commercial?" "Forget the commercial. Get out." "How much time?" A pause. 90 seconds. Carson nodded. 90 seconds. He could do 90 seconds. He turned to camera one, looked directly into the lens, and spoke to the millions of people watching. "Folks," he said, his voice calm, almost gentle, "we're having a little situation here tonight. Nothing serious, but I think Burt and I are going to step outside for a bit. We'll be right back." He stood. Reynolds stood. And then, instead of walking toward the nearest exit, Carson walked toward the fire. Reynolds grabbed his arm. "What are you doing?" "There are people backstage," Carson said simply. He was right. In the chaos, no one had confirmed that all the crew had evacuated. Writers, assistants, makeup artists, dozens of people who worked in the rooms behind the stage. Reynolds didn't argue. He followed. They pushed through the smoke, hands covering their mouths. The heat was extraordinary, pressing against them like a physical weight. Carson couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. He heard a voice, faint, coughing. He found her in a makeup room, 20 feet from the main stage. A young woman, maybe 25, crouched behind a counter, too scared to move. Carson didn't know her name, didn't know what she did, didn't matter. He pulled her up. Reynolds took her other arm, and they half carried, half dragged her toward the exit. At 5:54 p.m., Johnny Carson, Burt Reynolds, and a makeup artist whose name he would never learn stumbled out of Studio One into the parking lot. The fire department arrived 90 seconds later. By 6:15 p.m., the fire was out. The damage was extensive, but contained. Studio One would be closed for 3 months of repairs. No one was hurt. Not a single injury. The Tonight Show never announced what happened. The network edited the footage, spliced in a pre-recorded segment, and aired the show as if nothing had gone wrong. Most people who watched that night never knew there had been a fire at all. But the crew knew. The staff knew. And they knew something else too. Johnny Carson, the man who smiled on cue and told jokes with mechanical precision, had walked into a burning building to make sure everyone got out. 3 days later, Carson was back in his dressing room, preparing for another show. His assistant knocked on the door. "There's someone here to see you," she said. The makeup artist stood in the hallway. She was holding a card, handwritten, that she'd been too nervous to give him in person. Carson took it, read it, folded it carefully and put it in his pocket. "Thank you," he said. She smiled, started to say something, changed her mind, walked away. Carson never opened that card again, never mentioned the fire in interviews, never told the story on air, but he kept the card, tucked it in the same drawer as the photograph of his younger self. Sometimes, on nights when the weight felt heavier than usual, he would sit alone in his dressing room and think about the choice he'd made. Not the choice to stay on stage. That had been easy. That was just doing his job. The choice to walk back in. He'd had 3 seconds to decide, and he'd chosen to be the kind of man he'd always hoped he was. Whether anyone ever knew about it didn't matter. He knew. At 5:47 p.m. on that night in 1976, a fire started in the walls of Studio One. It burned for 27 minutes, consumed $500,000 worth of equipment, and came within 60 seconds of destroying the entire set of The Tonight Show. 40 million people watched Johnny Carson that night. None of them saw the fire. But in a dressing room 3 days later, a man sat alone with a card he would never open again. And for the first time in a long time, he recognized the person in the photograph. Not because he'd done something heroic, but because he'd done something human. The Tonight Show returned to air 3 months later in a rebuilt Studio One with new fire alarms, updated wiring, and a sprinkler system that would never be needed. Johnny Carson told his monologue jokes. Burt Reynolds told his stories. Doc Severinsen played his trumpet. Everything looked the same. But in the quiet moments between commercial breaks, when the audience couldn't see and the cameras were off, Carson sometimes looked at the back wall, new, clean, unmarked, and remembered the night it had burned. He never spoke about it, but he never forgot it either. And on nights when the weight felt too heavy, when the smile felt too fixed, when the role felt too small for the person wearing it, he would think about those 90 seconds. The 90 seconds when he'd chosen to be more than a performer. When he'd chosen to be a man who walked back into the fire. Not because anyone was watching, but because someone needed help. That was the night Johnny Carson stopped pretending he was invincible and started being someone worth remembering. The cameras never caught it. The audience never saw it. History never recorded it. But it happened. In the smoke and the heat and the chaos of a burning stage, something shifted. Not in the world, in the man. And that, more than any joke he ever told or any interview he ever conducted, was the moment that mattered. The moment he stopped being Johnny Carson, the performer, and became Johnny Carson, the person. The fire burned for 27 minutes, but the memory lasted the rest of his life.